Good evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. I will begin with a land acknowledgement. We're here on Dena'ina El Nena in the Anchorage Museum this evening. We are the Renewable Energy Alaska Project, and all of our work, we draw immense inspiration from the Alaska Native peoples, and in this instance, the Dena'ina peoples, as we work to accelerate the development of clean energy solutions and try and build a brighter future for these lands and waters and peoples. So I want to be grounded in that this evening for our discussion. First off, also want to thank you all for joining us. This is a pretty great turnout, really important topics. And so we really appreciate you taking the time this evening to join us for this discussion and really ground ourselves in this moment. Also want to thank the Anchorage Museum for allowing us to use this space this evening. Really generous, beautiful place, and we want to keep it that way. And so would remind folks to please refrain from drinking or eating in the auditorium this evening. Really appreciate you all doing that. And also want to give a great shout out to the REAP crew and staff. We really pulled together to bring this event to you all this evening. A lot of hard work has gone into it, and just want to shout out every single member of our team who made it possible. So this is the final installment of our 2024 Fall Energy Speaker Series. We've got an amazing slate of speakers in front of you tonight. I have the honor of introducing our moderator, which I'll do in a second, but my name is Donovan Russo-Niello. I'm the Outreach Director at REAP, and as part of my role here, I manage our fundraising. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that it takes a lot of staff hours, but also resources to bring this information and these events to you all. And so if you find value in what we say this evening, the information we bring to you, and the work that REAP does, I would urge you to please check out our website and consider donating to keep this work going. But as I mentioned, I have the honor of introducing our moderator this evening, Elizabeth Arnold, former NPR correspondent for the White House.
I usually try to find somebody that I kind of fix on, you know, like that one person that you keep looking at, and there's this little baby down here. It's just like, I'm going to be looking at this baby all night. Also, I want to point out that our chairs are less comfortable than yours. And so we promise this won't go, 3 hours or more, because we'll be dying up here. Hello and welcome to yet another exciting and hopefully insightful forum on the challenges that we face meeting Railbelt energy needs. I've been privileged to moderate a few of these events in the past, and I'll sort of sketch out a little background that we've covered in the past for those of you who are new in the audience, and just kind of the lay of the land before we get into it. And then I'll introduce our panelists, and we'll get rolling, and then there's time for you guys to ask questions as well. Also, if we get too into the weeds up here, or too many acronyms are flying around, there's a great, in your program, if you haven't seen it, section that explains all the acronyms, but just wave your arms and we'll just stop and we'll regroup, because these guys have a tendency to get really into the weeds. So DNR has been projecting a gas shortfall since 2009. That's a long time ago. To keep up with the demand, the region would have to drill something like 15 new wells a year to avoid running short in 3 years. And we'll get into this a bit tonight. The reality of an Alaska LNG pipeline is pretty unlikely. And thus far, the utilities have not exactly been jumping on the renewables bandwagon. In fact, they really haven't diversified their portfolio in 30 years. We Alaskans have a tendency to want to wait for like one big thing, right? We, a pipeline, a new oil field, the bumper sticker. Please God, give us another boom. We promise we won't piss this one away. And the reality is it's not really this or that or one new big thing. It's a combination of things. And the fact is we're going to be relying on gas for heat for a long time. In the meantime, something else has got to give. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Most Cook Inlet gas is used for heating, about 2/3. In 2022, as most all of you are probably aware, Hillcorp told all the utilities when your contracts expire, you're SOL. We can't guarantee price, and we can't guarantee quantity. So bottom line, we're running out of economically recoverable gas in Cook Inlet. I learned that a long time ago in natural resource reporting. There's a really big difference between gas and economically recoverable gas. Same with oil. Same with minerals, actually, too. Meanwhile, there's been a pretty big drop in the cost of renewable energy as technology and manufacturing improves. So where does that leave us? We've had a renewable portfolio standard legislation introduced the past 2 sessions with bipartisan support, but it's languished, as bills tend to do in the legislature and in Congress. And the hope, Chris will most likely address this in his closing remarks, the hope is this session might be a little different with the new legislature. So here to talk about all of this and how I'm going to be able to afford my NSTAR and Chugach electric bills in the next decade are 3 esteemed experts in the field, and I'd like to introduce the panel. Full and lengthy bios about all of us are in your program. Anthony Scott is REAP's Director of Economic and Regulatory Analysis. He's been conducting policy analysis of energy issues here in Alaska for more than 2 decades. He served in a variety of positions at DNR, and most recently was Commissioner of the RCA, Regulatory Commission of Alaska. Marty Schwartz is an electrical engineer at the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, where he models utility-scale power grids to identify the impacts of electric sector decarbonization on power grids of various sizes. Unfortunately for us, in his current position, he's also focused on least cost pathways for the Alaska Railbelt region. And last but not least, Larry Pursley. Oh God, Larry, where do I start with you? He's been up here for 47 years reporting on public policy, making public policy, trying to make public policy, telling us all about public policy. Criticizing public policy, teaching my students about public policy. Primarily focused on oil and gas, resource development, taxes. He's been in and out of government several times, but always with a keen eye on energy and fiscal issues. And I say this as a journalist myself, Alaska's very lucky to have him here. So, and we're very lucky to have all of you here. So let's get into it, and we're going to start with the current reality. And I want to start with you, Larry. Hi. Would I be correct in saying the market for Cook Inlet gas is just too dang small? And if so, how is the Railbelt going to get gas to address this supply shortage that everyone is wringing their hands about?
Is this on?
You see the little
The green button?
green light.
Oh. Yeah, Cook Inlet is a very small market. You know, so for example, your Hill Corp, you could spend $1 billion more looking for gas in Cook Inlet, which they, in their first decade, they spent about $1 billion down here. You can spend $1 billion, you'll find some gas, you can sell it, you can make a little bit of money, or you can take that same $1 billion, spend it on the North Slope, where you have substantial oil interests, and make a lot more money. It's just business to them. And no company from somewhere else is going to come up here, spend that kind of money for this little pissant market. We are. I mean, we burn what the rest of the world leaks in a day, which is methane emissions, another problem. So, yeah, we're not very attractive, even though it's important to us. And the other half of the question was?
So how is the Railbelt going to get gas to address the supply shortage?
So obviously, NSTAR, which sells gas, is in a different position than Chugach, Matanuska Electric, Homer Electric, Golden Valley. They sell electricity, which they can generate, hopefully, with more renewables. They can generate with diesel if you're short of gas. NSTAR has to have gas. They got to sell it. And they're sort of immune to the price. They get their cost plus. They don't like the bad press, but if it's more expensive, it doesn't really affect their bottom line. So where are you going to have to get it? If you don't get it out of Cook Inlet, realistically, you're going to have to import liquefied natural gas. I guess the argument would be import liquefied natural gas from probably Canada. It's going to be the closest supply for as long as you need until the electrical utilities reduce their gas demand by going to renewables so that more of the gas is available for N-Star to sell for heating, and then you live happily ever after. Well, that's a simplistic answer.
I remember at one of the forums, I can't remember which one, but because it's all a blur, we were like, well, that's just crazy.
Yeah, it's of course embarrassing. We're Alaska, right?
Right.
We have a congressional delegation, a governor, a bunch of ding-dong legislators who are saying we're a storehouse of energy, and we're going to have to import, or more than likely import natural gas from Canada. So most of our propane comes from Canada. Our maple syrup comes from Canada. No one's upset about it. If imported liquefied natural gas, we supercool the gas to a liquid so you can stuff it in a tanker, bring it up here, warm it back up, turn it to a gas. If importing liquefied natural gas from Canada is cheaper than getting new, expensive gas out of Cook Inlet, don't consumers want the cheapest gas they can get with the most dependable supply? And who cares if it has a maple aroma instead of rotten eggs and sulfur? What's the difference?
So I just want to backtrack. Traditionally, the Alaska way is to throw money at things. And so why wouldn't we throw money at it? Let's have a lot of incentives for these producers. How'd that go with
Incentives,
the
another word for
Cook Inlet Recovery Act?
Billions of dollars from the Cook Inlet Recovery Act, and we're still sitting here saying, gee, we're going to be sucking air soon. Incentives are subsidies. There was a legislator yesterday at a House Resources hearing said, we're going to get $4 billion in federal subsidy for a gas line. $4 billion, assuming the damn thing is built on budget, which I guarantee wouldn't happen anyhow. $4 billion works out to about $7,500 of government subsidy for every consumer in the Railbelt. Family of four, that's $30,000. If you had that kind of money to burn, do you want to put $30,000 to subsidize a gas line that's still going to be expensive? What you could do with schools, the university, childcare with $30,000. We're just warped.
On the topic of subsidies too, there already exist on the federal level a significant amount of money. You don't have to go looking for another $4 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act. Of course, the future of that is uncertain, as it is for any long-term federal subsidy. But that does exist right now, and could be up to 40% for the investment tax credit for new renewables. So I think it's nice to look at subsidies that are already pledged and exist, and the money's there.
Right.
So
Smart
available.
subsidies as opposed to dumb subsidies.
Well, and those subsidies also don't require any congressional appropriation,
Yeah.
as opposed to subsidies for a gas line, which
Yeah.
I have a hard time wrapping my head around why Congress would shell out billions of dollars for an Alaska project that provided gas to Alaskans.
Right.
I mean, what's the national interest there?
Right. Or why, if you're a Gulf state congressman, senator, and you're going to vote federal subsidies for a project that is intended to compete against your own project selling gas into Asia? Yeah.
Can everybody
Maybe
hear?
not.
Can everyone hear Larry? Larry,
Okay.
you need to
Yeah.
use the mic a little. Work the mic. Be a rock star. Okay. Anthony, why is gas so important to the Railbelt? And let's get back into the LNG contracts, how they might be structured. How would this work? How do you see this working?
Well, in your introduction, you already explained, right? We use gas to heat all of our homes and businesses, and we use gas to generate in the Railbelt as a whole. I think it's 70% of our electricity, close to that. Right now, we're 15% renewables, and the rest is thermal. But some of that's coal. Anyway, so we're dependent right now. And we're going to stay dependent on gas, as Larry said, for heat for the foreseeable future. That's going to be a much longer term transition, assuming that we have one. The next part of your question, though, was slipped it.
Yeah, you and Larry can both talk about this. How do you see the LNG contracts? How do you see them being structured?
Well, LNG contracts historically have always been tied to a petroleum index. I mean, that's the long-term history of that, is they were always tied and indexed to petroleum prices, which are, as we all know as Alaskans, are pretty volatile. So there's been some movement away from only petroleum to mix of petroleum and some Henry Hub maybe. But my best guess, and I really don't know how LNG contracts to serve our market will be structured because I'm not part of the negotiations, but Larry explained our volumes are pissant small. So it's not going to be enough to make any new project go. So if I'm a supplier and you've got uncertain quantity needs that are pretty small, I have a hard time understanding why I would sell to you at anything other than spot prices, or maybe spot plus some, to guarantee you your supply when you call on me for it. And spot is wildly volatile in the program. There's a chart looking at Japanese spot LNG prices over the last 10 years as compared to what we've paid locally. And the spot prices, I mean, it's just a commodity. It's determined by supply and demand at the time. We're in for a wild ride, I think, in terms of how we heat our homes. It just seems to me insane that we would commit ourselves continually to doing that for making most of our electricity.
So again, getting back to where the LNG would come from, I think more than likely Canada. There's a project under construction in Kitimat, British Columbia, just not that far from the Alaska border. Shell is the lead on that project. They're supposed to start producing next year. What Alaska would need for the next several years, if we have to fill in that gap between South Central production and our demand, like maybe 10 days of production from that plant. I mean, it's just a small amount. So as Anthony said, we're not going to be driving the price or making the project. They're testing it out. It's already built. I would expect the utilities or the trader is going to say, hey, I need a little bit. I need a couple ships a year. Do you have some available that's not under contract? We can buy whatever the price du jour is that day. The gas would come up. It would be probably held in storage and then drawn out as it's needed. Depending on the market, it could be substantially more than what we're paying now. Could be close. Certainly not going to be cheaper. No. And then there's a cost of tankering it. There's a cost of storing it. If you don't build an onshore receiving terminal, because that's a permanent investment of hundreds of millions of dollars, there's talk, well, maybe the utilities could rent what's called a floating storage regasification unit, basically a ship that's tied to the dock that stores your LNG and warms it back up to put in the pipeline. It's like leasing a car. It's less capital intensive. You're not buying the car, but you're paying a lot more every month to lease it. So utilities are going to have to figure out, do they want to make a 20-year investment or a 5-year lease? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to guarantee the lease payments? Who's going to use it? So those are all unknown, or at least to us.
But Larry, wow, it's from Canada. It should be cheap, right? I mean, they're just right there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, should be. Well, depending on the value of the dollar and the Canadian dollar, right?
Well, I mean, I'm being facetious, of course. Like, if I can sell a little bit of gas to Alaskans, but I could also just turn around and sell it to the Japanese or the Koreans or Taiwanese or what have you, I'm happy to put it on a ship and sell it to them.
Right,
instead.
they're not going to give us a bargain. So if that tanker load of gas is worth $10 or $12 in Asia, that's what it's going to cost us to buy it. There's no nice guy neighbor discount.
Who is footing the bill
for buying the gas?
for all of this?
That would be us.
Yeah. Well, just Anthony. I'm not paying.
So you're leaving.
No, I'm just not going to pay my bills.
Okay.
So considerable impact.
Yeah, fairly astonishing, actually. The base case assumption is our gas prices are going to go up by about 50% from what we've been paying recently. That's sort of a best guess. right? You hire consultants, and they'll tell you, well, based on a lot of things and a lot of money that you paid me, I will tell you that the price of gas is going to be $12, or it's going to be $12.50, or whatever. And that's a best guess, and it's probably a pretty good guess even. But that doesn't mean it's the most likely or average price we're going to see. There's a funny thing about prices, which is that they don't go below zero on the downside, and on the upside, they're unbounded. And as the chart that's in your program shows, and we've recently seen natural LNG prices spike to above $60. It's easy to tell a story, right, and they're 8 now. It's easy to tell a story where they could go considerably higher, depending upon what happens in terms of world conflict.
Yeah. One thing to keep in mind, and I'll try to do the math, but I failed calculus in college. So if the new gas that you're buying, let's say you go with imported LNG, it's 50% more. For the electrical generation utilities, the cost of gas is about a third of the bill that you get, because there's obviously other costs, generating plants, distribution. And it's not like all of their gas would go from affordable Cook Inlet to expensive LNG overnight. So if let's say 20% of their gas was imported at 50% more than it used to be, but that's only a third of their overall bill, you're not going to see a 50% increase in your electric bill the next month. It's going to depend how much they pay and then how much more expensive gas they have to burn as opposed to legacy gas.
But also, is it my understanding, I'm not an economist, but even if you're only importing, say, 20% of the gas, that LNG import price will still set the price for the local producers, because they wouldn't necessarily want to offer cheaper gas. I mean, maybe, but
they're under contract.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
There's
The longer-term contracts would stay cheaper.
They are, which are also rolling off
Right, I'm thinking the older
inconveniently around
contracts.
2028.
So regardless, it's not a pretty picture.
no.
Okay.
Right.
Let's bring Marty in here. Marty, tell us a little bit about NREL. What has been the lab's involvement with the Railbelt over the last few years? Tell us.
Sure, yeah. Maybe I'll just explain kind of why I'm here, since I don't actually
Who are
pay.
you?
I don't pay NSTAR bills, unfortunately, so I don't live here. But yeah, so NREL is one of 17 national labs, all part of a large complex in the Department of Energy. Originally founded Los Alamos. If you saw Oppenheimer, you saw the beginning of the national lab story. But since we've expanded to do much more than maintain the nuclear arsenal, thankfully, because that's not what I work on. So the role of the national labs really, as I see it, is to sort of bridge the gap for industry, for technologies that are maybe not, for doing research that is not quite economic yet, and helping industries get to market so that the R&D they do can then support them in, a for-profit business. So we help fill the gaps and kind of move industry along. Right now, I'm actually working largely in the hydrogen space, so that's a pretty new what we call low TRL, world technology readiness level technology, and we help bring that sort of to be profitable. Similarly, we do a lot of work on power grids. So that's more of my background, was working on electrical grids and looking at decarbonization specifically, because utilities all around the world, they perform what's called integrated resource planning, generally to look at what types of investments they'll need to make in the next few years to keep the lights on and to make sure they're taking advantage of the cheapest resources that are out there and planning ahead so that they can keep prices down for their customers, especially when their customers, if they're a member-owned co-op, they have a special burden to their customers to keep costs down and lowest available. So they'll generally do that on, a medium term, few years, 5-10 year basis. But what utilities generally don't have the resources to do or to look at, decades ahead in the future. And that's where you have other planning agencies come in and do that work to look at further afield, what happens in 2040, 2050 as these prices change, and, what is kind of a dramatically different future look like for these systems as these prices go the way they're going, as we start to electrify the world, as EVs start to take off, heat pumps, and the fundamental nature of electrical demand changes and grows. So those are the types of questions that NREL has been very poised to ask, and that's we've done that in the lower 48, we've done that in India, in large countries in Asia and Europe, And that's how I got involved in the Railbelt. This is a very interesting system to me. It's, of course, not a drop in the bucket when it comes to electrical demand, but it does have some unique challenges that will be especially informative to the rest of the world. And those unique, there's a lot of unique things about this place, and I also really love coming here. But one of those is that the grid itself it's essentially a large microgrid that's not a mesh. It's not an actual grid as you think of it, as like a box. It's just basically one long extension cord. So there are a lot of technical electrical engineering challenges that come along with it. There are, as we discussed, a lot of economic challenges. And we got involved at the request of the governor's office a few years ago to look at the impact of a proposed renewable portfolio standard on the Railbelt. So that was kind of our guiding question that we used to justify building a brand new model and looking at this power grid from the future onwards. And so that's sort of where I see my role. And I've been lucky enough to meet a lot of people in the space here and kind of hear how things are going and how we got to this point and what the future might hold. So that's an overview of why this Coloradan is sitting here today. So I'm actually from New Jersey, but came from Colorado.
You
so
don't
if
sound
that
like
helps, I don't know if that helps at all.
Well, from your vantage point and with your worldview, what do you see? You mentioned some challenges. There was a study published this year.
Yeah, this February, I believe.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, so that came out, like I mentioned, originally came at the request of the governor's office to identify the financial impact of an 80% renewable portfolio standard, which would mean that by 2040, the utilities would be mandated to produce at least 80% of their electricity from renewable sources. So just electricity, not heating. And we ran that analysis with our best guess projections for the cost of every type of electrical generation technology in the mix, and also abiding by the very real engineering constraints that exist on the system. And we found a pretty clear story, just really based on two inputs that I'll mention after. But we found that there could be up to $100 million per year in savings once we get into the 2030s and beyond, if we switch to a largely wind-based system on the Railbelt. And we actually found that without any type of policy, the cheapest overall solution for the Railbelt would get you to 76% renewable generation. So of all of the kilowatt hours produced in the year, 76% of them produced largely by wind and existing hydropower would actually save the most money to the system as a whole. There are a lot of assumptions that are baked into that I can get into, but we have to stay out of the weeds, and I know it's hard for me. It's a very enticing place to go. But I'll just mention the two main, these are not weeds, this is like high level stuff. It's a complicated, there's a lot of unique challenges, but compared to a system like the lower 48 where you have 100,000 nodes, it's a relatively simple system to study. The model runs more quickly. You can tweak it. You can increase the precision of the model because it's small enough. And the two main inputs that really drive that result are this price of natural gas. That's actually probably the number one. So the fact that we're going from under $10 per MMBTU, and MMBTU is just a unit of energy. You could think of it as a kilowatt hour, so same for what's on your electric bill. So $8 per unit of gas, up to $12 as just the very conservative number. And that jump might not seem like a lot, it's just a few dollars, but on the scale of the electricity system, because so much of it is produced by gas right now, that leads to, if you can get away from gas and move towards other sources, you can save significant amounts of money across that horizon of 16 years out to 2040. So that input really has large implications, and despite the fact that we can run fancy models and tweak little things, that margin is so large that it's a pretty clear story in my mind, and you could get the same result by just doing something quickly in Excel or just a back of the envelope calculation. We often are asking questions that are very nuanced, that there's kind of a knife edge. You have to see if you change something, the result changes a lot. This is not really one of those cases, I would say. And it's largely because of that gas number. The other assumption that certainly is subject to lots of uncertainty is the cost of wind. So at a very simplistic way, you can say how much is wind going to cost and how much is gas going to cost. And we have projections that wind will decrease. We have scores of people, like not even exaggerating. We have dozens and dozens of people that work on just looking at market projections of renewable energy technologies throughout the world every year. So it's called the Annual Technology Baseline. That's, as I see it, it's maybe a dry topic because it's a big spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers and financial calculations, but it is one of the most important outputs that NREL produces. It's not necessarily something that any other organization would be incentivized to produce, so it's one of those kind of public goods, I see it. We work a lot with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to produce this market report, and that goes into the inputs for a lot of our planning models that give us these results. So we adopted those for Alaska, and of course things are not the same up here. It's a lot harder to source materials and to build things, so we had significant multipliers on those numbers and boosted those prices up to two times the cost of things in the lower 48. But they still do decline, and that declining makes that $100 million savings, so that's why it's so large and robust. And it also means that you see a point where as gas prices increase and largely wind, but also solar PV prices decrease, there is a crossover point where things start to get cheaper on a per unit energy basis. There are lots of other aspects that make it not as simple as just selling pig ears or whatever commodity you could think of. I think of that movie Trading Places. I don't know. So the electricity is a lot more complicated than your average commodity. But on a high level, usually the vast majority of the cost is in these simple terms of per energy basis, fuel versus capital cost of a renewable plant. So, yeah, that's what I see.
So you said that the governor's office asked for this. What was? I can't help myself. What was the response?
Oh, their response to the.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I don't. We've been invited to come talk about the study quite a lot by the governor's office since, so there's still a lot of engagement. I have been in meetings with him, but I wouldn't say that there was like a clear feedback, specific feedback on the study itself.
I don't mean to put you on this.
No, it's okay. I just don't have much clear feedback. I did get the chance to present it. I know the Sustainable Energy Conference in May is essentially put on by the governor's office. So that's, if you can think of that as an extension of his office. We were invited to speak there and had a good audience. And I know that my lab director was up during that conference with the whole leadership team, his whole posse, and I believe they had a meeting together. I'm not privy to those high-level discussions, but I know they're still in discussions, and there are things above my pay grade, and there's still a relationship going. So
again, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's all good.
Let's go back a little bit to the Alaskan way of doing things. We love our pipelines and our big projects and big solutions. Larry, what about the Alaska LNG bullet line? Is this possible?
Well, so they're two separate projects. The Alaska LNG is where you build a big gas conditioning plant on the North Slope to take out the CO2, a massive pipeline, compressor stations, a liquefaction plant, probably in Nikiski, though maybe over Point McKenzie's dead body, but because they want it there, and a marine terminal, you ship it to Asia. The bullet line, which has been around for, 15 years or so, the notion that, the whole export thing's not economical, we're in a crisis mode, we'll just build a hunkin' big gas pipeline from the North Slope to South Central. We'll bring gas to ourselves. Both billion, the export, the LNG project, I think is probably more in the range of 50 billion plus, even though they claim 40, but I don't think you could do it for 50. The bullet line or Alaska standalone pipeline, it's also been known as that. That project, they say 10 to 12, I don't buy that. So they need a lot of capital, a lot of customers, a lot of financing, a lot of partners, and after decades, we got none of them. In Yiddish, it's bupkis. Someone else can translate.
So you don't really see this as a happening thing.
I told the group down the Kenai, someone said, "We're going to get a gas line." I said, "No." And my answer was, the Cubs won the World Series in 2016. Everyone gets one miracle in their lifetime. That's it. There's no 3 wishes from the genie. No. There's infinitely more gas in the world that's cheaper, lower risk, easier to build than ours. It's not like Copper River salmon, where people will pay a premium. Like Anthony said, it's a commodity. The buyers in Asia are looking for a dependable, affordable commodity, not a premium for a made in Alaska sticker. So no, I don't think there's any hope of the LNG project. And sure, a big mega project for Alaska. We love mega projects here. Susitna Dam. What's the stupid bridge? The Kinnickarm Crossing. That's another one. Pipelines.
Don't hold back, Larry.
It's like until we get away from the mega projects going to solve the problems of the world and get some honest political leadership, we're just going to be wallowing in the mud.
Okay, perfect. That's where we're heading. So, so we can all agree that a natural gas pipeline and more gas from Cook Inlet are both pretty unlikely to happen in any realistic time frame to address this need that we have.
Yes.
And he knows more about economics than me, so I'm with him.
All right, then let's talk renewables. I mean, you said so. Can the Railbelt get to 76% renewables without impacting the reliability of the system?
Yeah, that's a weighty term, reliability. Yes is a quick answer. So
Okay.
I should keep things simple. Yes, we believe so. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges to overcome in order to get there.
Can we talk about those challenges?
Yes, certainly.
Okay.
Don't have to tell you guys that the sun doesn't shine all the time here. In fact, like this time of year, it was just sailing right on the horizon. So essentially, when you want to talk about reliability, solar has essentially no contribution whatsoever to reliability. You can't count on it at all. Wind, however, has a little bit, and so there are some sophisticated mathematical ways to measure what the reliability of a resource is. Essentially, how much of its capacity can you count on at all times? And with wind, it's essentially looking at the resource over many years and seeing what you can count on. But of course, you can firm it up, is what it's called. Increase that firm capacity, that reliability, by adding storage like batteries. And I just want to highlight that Alaska is a pioneer in utility scale battery development. So in Golden Valley, I don't know exactly what year it was, but they installed the world's largest utility scale battery for purposes like of grid reliability. Really, I'll just keep using that word when there are other jargon words I could throw around. And so we're not a stranger to utilizing batteries to firm up the grid. Haven't used it to firm up hundreds of megawatts of wind, which is what our study showed would be the most economic. And those are certainly next level challenges that need to be addressed. But luckily we have a precedent. If you look at, so we can't really use the lower 48 as a great guide because it's such a big system. There's thousands of generators that are always online that can help out when the wind dies. Of course, we don't have that in Alaska. But Hawaii faced the same challenges, largely more with the solar resource, but they were able to Kauai could get up to 100% renewables, which they never thought was even close to possible. So they're already breaking records and defying laws that they thought were kind of hard and fixed in terms of reliability at these very high levels of renewables. So there are challenges in Alaska. I think can face them. There's lots of help. There's a lot of more modeling work that needs to be done, but luckily it's a pretty hot area of research in the power engineering world of how to run these systems on high levels of what we call inverter-based generation. So anything that isn't a giant spinning turbine, which is where we're headed. So The answer is yes, but with lots of technical challenges that I'm excited about.
And
Yeah, just a couple of minor things. Reliability of any given generation asset is never perfect.
Yeah.
We could talk about the Healy 2 coal project in Fairbanks. Its reliability is, its capacity factor is bad, and Golden Valley was looking at retiring that plant wildly prematurely because the power from that plant is so expensive on an operational basis. They've since changed course because right now they don't feel like they have any alternatives. But as soon as they do, I expect they'll retire that plant because it sputters along. The one thing about the 76%, Marty said this in passing, and I think he means something a little more subtle than this. He said, well, we don't need policy to get to 76%. And I think all you mean by that is shorthand for it's the most economic answer. It is the least cost answer for us in the Railbelt. And Marty's been good enough and his team has been good enough to give us a lot of their data. And so we've built our own model to replicate what they've done and extended it a little bit. But, those results are incredibly robust. In terms of where you would want to make your bets, in terms of, well, maybe natural gas will get really cheap, or maybe we could have very stably priced renewables. It's a pretty clear bet on where you would want to go. I guess the one thing, though, that I would say is I don't think we get to 76% without policy. It's a famous phrase in the oil business, oil's discovered first in the mind. It takes someone with imagination to want to go out and find oil and take risks and do things. I think managing this energy transformation requires a similar adventurousness in the mind on the part of the people who make those decisions. And the easiest thing to do, of course, is to continue to rely on the technologies that we've been relying on. And some of us are a little bit frustrated with the pace of the transition, which is kind of not really happening in a material way just yet.
Yeah, one thing I'll mention about policy, the tough part about these models is they're so idealistic and never actually represent reality in a very accurate way. It's more of kind of a idealistic shining light of what you could reach, never actually will, because there's human factors and political factors and other economic factors that simply aren't captured. The biggest one I will mention is that those declining wind prices that I mentioned, the annual technology baseline, that's on a global level, and that assumes a global amount of competitive free market. So that doesn't exist right now in Alaska at all. There's a pretty small market for gas and for electricity. We don't have. There's just not that much demand here, and there's not much incentive for a large wind developer to come build the plant. So that's one potential avenue for policy to really play a role and to help kind of spur a market and then get those prices to actually decline in Alaska, where they are declining in the rest of the world. So the raw materials are there, and they are already cheaper than fossil fuels in many contexts, most contexts, but in order for those prices to be realized in Alaska, you need multiple developers competing for the resource, essentially, just like any other market. And that's something that probably wouldn't happen on its own without some sort of regulatory push. And there are lots of examples of government stepping in that sort of role of helping start, kind of jumpstart a market so that overall you get to a cheaper solution. Yeah, that's where, and those things are certainly not, we don't have the capability to model them in this particular techno-economic model that's really focused on the power grid. But that's something that I'm not an expert in, but that's where I see the role of government and policy. So I know we didn't quite get to that part, but.
Well, we're not even there yet. What happens if the tax incentives go away? And Anthony?
Yes, Anthony could just study that.
I have recently looked at it. If these very large federal income tax subsidies disappear, which clearly could happen.
Yeah, I just don't know where Elon Musk is on that.
Yeah, the price of wind power would go up. I mean, it's delivered to the Railbelt significantly. No question about that. So does that mean, and they may go up enough such that when you look at, well, I think we're going to get $12 gas imported into Cook Inlet, and you use that as a static number to compare with offsetting, more expensive wind, you might go, well, I think I'll just stick with the gas. I mean, that can happen. The thing is, again, if you look at gas as a commodity, which it will be for us, it's highly volatile and it never goes below zero. There's a floor. So it can never go down very much, and it can and does go up from time to time quite a lot. And so when you start modeling that space, that uncertainty space of those movements, overall, in terms of a 16-year time horizon, and really we should be thinking about longer, but the overwhelming amount of kind of probability space is, with or without investment tax credits, transitioning to renewables is the better bet. And it doesn't even get into the question, which I think is very considerable, that Marty raised, of having clear government policy standards saying this is how much renewables you need to achieve by certain dates, creates a market which allows for competition. And right now, again, we really have none among suppliers. And what we really don't, it's not even just competition. There's no market certainty. Yeah. If I'm a developer, why do I want to spend years trying to work up a project and sell to a monopoly utility who is a service provider? Hey, please buy my product. You've got no certainty that they're going to be buyers. There's no obligation there. Mm-hmm. And so those transaction costs are fixed, and they're high up here especially because there's no market certainty, whereas in the lower 48, most of the grids there are competitive. You have wholesale competitive generation. And so if you can deliver cheap power, you can get into the grid as a general matter. So it's a little more complicated than that, but you do have these market forces which provide real discipline, which we just do not have here. So that was very long-winded, sorry.
No, it was great. Larry, what do you think about all that? Best bet.
I mean, best bet, correct me if I'm wrong, Hawaii, it's a matter of state law in Hawaii, right? They have a renewable portfolio standard that says X percentage has to come from renewables by this year, next year. And so it's not policy, it's law in Hawaii, right?
Correct, yes,
yeah,
law,
okay.
yeah.
And it's law in 29 states.
Yeah. I think absent law, like Alaska has a renewable portfolio vision, and don't we? Right, it's not mandatory. But I remember there was legislators some years ago, and we have goals and aspirations, but it's not law. I think absent law, it's not going to happen. You need that kick in the head. One other thing I'll mention, if you start importing liquefied natural gas, as Anthony said, it's a world market, it's a commodity, it's whatever the price is that day. Kind of like when you go to a restaurant and the seafood special says market price. Same thing with gas. But then there's a cost, not just getting it here, but there's a cost to regasify it and inject it into storage at the Cook Inlet, SINGSA, Cook Inlet Natural Gas Storage. That adds another few dollars to it. So it's not a cheap way to do it. It's going to be expensive. So I think you're going to need a law, which gets back to political leadership, if we're going to say it makes more sense, maybe the federal subsidies go away, but it makes more sense to put money into the capital investments for something that then is not subject to commodity prices for decades, rather than subsidize a delivery for a commodity that you have no control over the price.
Hey, Marty, can you speak a little bit to economies of scale of, say, wind projects?
Sure, yeah, and that's another kind of issue in Alaska. And I'll actually take a tangent there for a second to talk about coal carbon capture. That's also kind of a topic that has been coming up recently. And that faces the same challenges of any large plant of that. I mean, it was just especially clear to me for that one that to make that economical, it would have to be, the plant itself would have to be on the order of the size of the entire Railbelt load, like one 600 megawatt plant to get a economic. And then as you get smaller, it just becomes less and less feasible.
But we like things big here.
Yeah, the Sisseton-Watana is a good example. That one's also was 600 megawatts, and just, I don't know, that's stalled out and a little bit too big. Kind of a technical issue with those larger plants is then you have you're depending on one large generator, and if that goes out, your largest contingency, it becomes much more challenging to manage the grid. So that could actually have negative impacts on reliability. But I assume you meant about like wind projects.
Yeah, just wind projects. I mean, I've seen NREL's work sort of looking at different size projects and how the cost comes down as the size of the project goes up, and then what that means for distributing power, to our 4 little utilities.
There are many benefits to going to large. I mean, first of all, if you need to build a spur, there's so many savings you can get by kind of grouping things together. If you're building your first wind farm way out, Little Mountain's sitting there somewhere that doesn't have a road to it yet, you have to build a road, you have to build a spur transmission line, you have to build all of the converter equipment, transformers, inverters, substations, switches, control, like so much that you could likely save as you go to the next wind farm. You'll need all the inverters and switches and some equipment and controls, but you can save on the road and the spur line, and you can generally make use of the resources that you've already developed nearby. So that's one benefit. The other one is just diversity. So the larger your wind plant or the number of wind plants you have, then you can take advantage of different wind patterns in different areas and overall have a more smooth output. So that's what we like to call geographic smoothing or geographic diversity. And the extreme case is a single wind turbine is, incredibly variable. But if you average all the wind turbines up and down the Railbelt, if you had some down in Homer that were connected to ones up near Delta Junction, you would have a much smoother output. And that's how you can get to a non-zero firm capacity, like I was saying before, where solar, pretty much zero. That's the end of the story. But with wind, if you can take advantage of that diversity, then that's a much more valuable resource from a grid operator perspective.
So the problem is on the demand side is you've got like big projects, cheaper, that's good, both north and south of the range. Okay, they're in different people's service territories. You've got more production out of large Delta Junction wind farm, say, or Little Matsu, or what have you, than the most proximate utility actually needs. And so one of the challenges, and one of the reasons why I think we do need policy, is we've got 4 different companies on this Railbelt, each of whom want the best deal. So if you're a wind developer, you say like, okay, I've got a big wind project, how much do each of you want? And the answer is, well, I'd like to get rights to have all of it when I need it, but I don't want to have to take any of it at any given time. And everybody has the same position, so they all kind of stare at each other like, you go first, no, you go first.
So is that true everywhere, or is it just the utilities up here? They don't work together.
It's particularly a problem, I think, here because our loads are so small. Our utilities manage very small loads compared to most generation and transmission companies outside.
Right, and there's very limited number of suppliers too in the lower 48 with the network or the transmission grid. If you're Detroit Edison, you can buy power from a lot of people.
So solving that coordination problem on the demand side, I think, requires policy, and then there's huge benefits in terms of the cost of supply if you have that policy. You've got regulatory certainty, you've got better economies of scale, but there are challenges, and just to overcome them requires some sort of push, I think.
And I guess an example of law that was just passed in 2024 this year that is helping move us towards that kind of ideal vision that's in the model that's unrealizable, but moving towards that is, I forget, HB 307, yeah. That is, that's moving us toward, moving the utilities into a place where they can work together and be more coordinated. So I don't know if we want to open up that can of worms, but I think there's already examples of how government is helping move towards that vision.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but these utilities have been talking about coordinating for decades, and they haven't gotten their act together? Why do we think now there's any hope that they could actually coordinate and act as
Like the
one
RCA
for
commissioner
the greater
answer.
good? Former Regulatory Commission of Alaska commissioner.
Well, I'm not a believer that this is going to magically self-organize. I mean, that's the short answer. I just, it's sort of like the gas line. We've got a lot of historical data. And now Lucy's asking Charlie Brown to take a run at the football once again.
What do you say to the legislator who says, well, if renewables are the cheapest option, why aren't they just doing it? I mean, why aren't these guys, what do we need a mandate for? Sorry, I don't know why I'm affecting a Southern accent.
That was pretty good.
You might be, they did it in Texas, that might be why.
South Anchorage accent.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah, I do. Unfortunately, I haven't figured out a good bumper sticker retort, right? I don't like mandates. It's a pretty good bumper sticker.
Yeah.
And the explanation for why mandates are appropriate tends to take up a full page, or at least several paragraphs. So that's a problem. I mean, we've been talking about just lately why it is that, in fact, these guys are very unlikely to magically, perfectly self-organize. That's unfortunate. I think, none of that is to say that anybody's not well-meaning. I think, as a general matter, people are. It's not that the people running our utilities don't care about their customers. I think, as a general matter, they really do. But everybody wants the best deal, and it's hard. They're understaffed, frankly. They don't have enough of the people to do the kind of innovative work that's going to be required to circumvent the challenges that Marty was talking about. It's something I've been observing and complaining about for a long time, and did when I was a commissioner. It's like, you guys need to hire more people, because it will pay dividends. In fact, when I worked at one of the utilities in Anchorage, it was clear as day we were leaving a lot of money on the table in terms of providing consumer value, but we needed more people to put together the value. And, well, that doesn't happen, because now you have to go and you have to ask for money from the assembly to hire these people, and that's a public, nobody wants to grow government. So it didn't happen. There's a similar dynamic, I think, with the co-ops too.
I also think it doesn't necessarily come from like a protectionist or malicious place. I think it comes from a place that traditionally and historically utilities had to rely on themselves to keep power. Even now there's a single extension cord running hundreds of miles up through some of the most rugged terrain up, the Alaska range. If that goes down, then we're back to, islanded grids. And that's why there's so much more thermal capacity in each individual utility than you might expect in a more meshed network. So I would say there was good reason for the way that things are so separated by zone. And there still is there's still a very fragile nature to the way we call it a Railbelt grid, but that's only while these lines are magically working, and it's all just a single line. So I think, and this is one thing that they all agree on, I think everyone agrees on, is the importance of transmission upgrades to not only allow more power transfer between utilities, but potentially, if there's a second line, to allow more redundancy for those connections. And then you can rely on them a lot more, and then start thinking towards a single balancing area, we call it, where the grid all operates together. So, having said that, the fact that they have operated individually for so long means that there's so much dependable thermal power plants essentially in each zone that ideally could be called on to work as operating reserves if we worked all as a single balancing area. So I'll say there are historical reasons for why it's been set up and so separated, but moving forward, the coordination is really the only way to go. So.
Well, and if your question was why hasn't the legislature?
No, a legislator would say, hey, if it's the cheapest way to go in renewables, then why aren't they doing it? You don't need us to tell them. They should just be doing it.
Right. But I think, as Anthony pointed out, we do need policy to get to the right answer. And I think a couple things work against us in the political world. There's a significant segment of Alaska politics does not believe in government mandates. And that makes it hard to get this kind of legislation through. And I think also there's a significant portion of our political leadership that reverts back to, well, oil and gas is the answer. So I don't like government mandates. Oil and gas is like my cornflakes. You know, it's what the country's built on. And get that renewable stuff out of here. Or go do it if you want, but don't ask me to vote for it.
Is the thinking with the law, and we don't have to call it mandates, right? Goals, right?
Standard.
Standard. It's a standard, right? Is the thinking with the standard that you might not necessarily get the utilities all on board and in line, but you're really incentivizing independent producers who, like Fire Island, and that's how the ball starts rolling.
It provides certainty for them that they can actually make a profit by doing that, which, yeah.
Yeah, I think really it does both. It's very good for developers because they know that if they've got a good project, there's a market that people they're required to buy. So that's a good thing. It's exceptionally important, really. But the other thing is that it provides economic incentive for the utilities to work together to solve these problems. Because the efficient answers require better coordination. And don't get me wrong, there are efforts. I will say I've worked on them from the inside and outside for a number of years. But things are ridiculously slow and they stall, and you can get one personality who scuttles the whole thing for a year and a half. And we're Alaskans. You guys get it. That's who we are. So,
it's Congress too.
Yeah, right. No, so it's both. I think having a standard creates incentives for people to work together, because if they don't, it's going to be more expensive and painful than if they do. And it's very important for developers. So it's on both sides, I think.
Did you want to talk about that or not?
I think you guys covered it pretty much. Yeah.
From the consumer point of view, advantages, disadvantages to a standard?
Reliable prices, I would say. Again, this study that we did not go to the point of estimating ratepayer impacts. So that's what a typical integrated resource plan might do, and I believe that's what the Railbelt Reliability Council is now slated to do by 2026, I believe. So that is the proper way to really answer this question. In order to do that, you need to know essentially everything about all the utilities' finances to see what rates might become. So I can't say I know what rates will do, but just given what the overall system costs are, we did have, I think, a back of the envelope calculate, and that really was back of the envelope, just to say like percentage change in overall system costs. If you assume the same percentage reduction in your bills, and electricity bills will go down. But what we can look at is price volatility. If not just NSTAR, but utilities are subject to fluctuating spot prices, natural gas spot prices, then those fluctuating prices will naturally get passed on to a consumer. The alternative is power purchase agreement, which is a typical contract that an independent power producer signs with the utility, which guarantees power at a set price. It's almost like a mortgage. You know exactly for 30 years what the cost of power will be. And so that input will help stabilize consumer rates. And we've seen that in other states as well. So without knowing exactly the impacts, I can say with certainty that's
That's a good analogy. Do you want a 30-year fixed rate mortgage and affordable interest, or do you want to take a variable rate and wake up every morning and wonder, oh, what the hell happened to my mortgage payment?
I always love the 30-year because you're like, that's a long time from now.
And we never thought we'd be
2050, like when's that?
But it's fixed.
Yeah.
Exactly. Disadvantages? Just putting you on the spot here. No, it's.
So I did a presentation yesterday looking at a lot of the uncertainty around prices and how that may play out in the future, and uncertainty around costs and what could go wrong and so on. And I was surprised at the degree to which the decision is really easy. I mean, it is always possible to bet wrong. It's always possible that the world turns out in ways that you didn't foresee, and you could have done something else that was even better. So, but the likelihood of that happening, based again on the work that I've done, is just really small. And then the upside from having, banked on the renewables are going to suck. When it shows up, that upside is also really small. And so it's just a bad bet. So we have to make policy bets. That's what we do. And it's kind of a no-brainer on where you would bet, right? If you have a 50-50 bet and one is a payoff of $10 and one's a payoff of $50, well, which side, do you want a 50% chance of $50 or a 50% chance at $10? It's kind of a no-brainer. In this case, it's like, well, do you want a 75% chance of $50 or a 25% chance of $10? It's a no-brainer.
The only downside I can think of is if we actually solve this issue, what the hell would we talk about? Chris would have to retire. You'd have no members.
So what are the obstacles in Juneau? You have a eye on Juneau. What do you see as the
Well, do you want numerical out of the 60 legislators? How many are obstacles?
in general?
Who is the problem, Larry? Name names.
Well, yeah, it's political. Like I say, some of it is an aversion to mandates, a addiction to oil and gas solves everything. It's, I want to say horse trading. It's how do you navigate essentially a political solution? Because you've got to keep in mind, well, there's the, now I'm spacing out on it, the subsidy for rural electric.
PCE.
Right, power cost equalization. So they're sitting there with a billion-dollar endowment, and that pays down rates, not to anything affordable, it pays it down. So you've got that. How do you put together a political compromise that deals with urban, Railbelt, Bush, where everyone walks away and feels they got something out of it? And how do you do it without much money? Because we don't have a whole lot. So I think it starts at the top. It's political leadership. You need a governor who's going to bring people together on this. And we don't have that at the moment. And we haven't had it. It's not like this is the first dodo in the job.
Okay. What about constituents? So does this work? I don't know. I mean, I covered fuel efficiency standards in Congress for years and years and years. And we kept saying, at what price point will this really work? When will people start buying electric cars? When will they start making all that? So is there some point when I look at my heating bill and I go, and my electric bill and go, this is nuts? And then you create a constituency, and then eventually we get to the lawmakers, and then eventually the lawmakers see the light. I mean, is that sort of the road we might be going on, or
The critical mass, where there's enough permission slip from the public to do something, even if there's some short-term pain.
Which we're trying to avoid.
yeah, because it takes
Right?
time, right?
Yeah, I mean, all of this transition takes time, but the amazing thing, at least to my mind, is having pursued a major natural gas sale from the North Slope for 10 years of my career, and it's always just 10 years out. How much can be done really comparatively quickly in terms of transitioning the Railbelt system? It's kind of remarkable. These renewable projects can be developed and then executed in relatively short order compared to what we're used to thinking in terms of oil and gas, which is always much longer lead times.
Yeah, and there are a lot of other renewable technologies that certainly. I mean, the best analogy, fusion is also always cold fusion is always 20 years away. There's a lot of promising resource, geothermal resource, tidal resource in Alaska, but at some point you look at what is already proven on the market, and you go to the boring or the more established boring wind and solar technologies. I remember when I first started at NREL, I was really excited about all these kind of niche, ocean current energy, and you take advantage of different temperatures in the ocean. You can produce energy in all these different amazing ways. But then as I worked more and more and worked on more least cost optimization models, you look at like what the cost is now and just what the economics say. And that's generally not looking at these lower technology readiness level technologies. That's not to say we should stop pursuing them, but I think it's just sort of an analogy to the pipeline even, or something that might take decades. That's true in the renewable space too. So honestly, it helps to focus on what is available now.
And as Anthony made the point, it's making that policy call, what bet looks like the better risk. So, I don't know, 2001, when the Alaska gas pipeline, North Slope pipeline, came off the shelf because we thought we were finally blessed. Since then, the state has spent about $1 billion on different iterations of North Slope gas pipelines, big, small, medium, reverse osmosis pipelines, who the hell knows? Until we stop betting on that turkey and start saying that bet is not a good one. We need to start putting our money on something else. We're losing time, which we don't have a lot of. But yes, you can do renewables quicker than a gas line. That's not going to happen.
The other thing is like waiting for the catastrophe to strike is a motivating factor. We're already seeing it, right? We've got net out-migration, which is considerably bigger than in-migration. And our population's getting old instead of being young. This is not a recipe for success of Alaska's economy. And so, we're underfunding our schools and so on and so forth. I think skyrocketing energy prices and doing nothing about them until it's really bad is not a good look for us going forward. So, we have an opportunity to make policy and make decisions going forward to blunt some of that. You never know when you've got the straw that breaks the camel's back, but we can't keep dumping more and more problems on our doorstep.
Marty, are we an anomaly, or have you seen similar situations in the lower 48, or?
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of renewable portfolio standards saving money in other states, and it doesn't break on any sort of typical political lines. A good example is Texas has one of the strongest RPSs and that's not because of advocacy or the politics of the people in the state. It's about the fact that they have a really good wind resource and a lot of it and a lot of land, and it's just financially made sense. So there is an expert at NREL, Jenny Sumner. If you're curious about RPSs in other states, they've done a lot of comparative analysis and looked at the overall impacts, cost, and of course it varies depending on the location. But Texas is a good example of a place that has such a good wind resource that they were able to take advantage and save money. I don't have figures on the top of my head of like impacts on ratepayer costs, but if it's in your head that it's political issue, you look at a place like Texas and a place that is focused on the economics, and that's a pretty compelling story to me. So Alaska, of course, is unique in that its grid is not connected to anyone else's, and so the challenges of integrating variable sources like wind are different and more significant potentially than in a place like Texas. Although Texas, of course, is its own grid as well, for those who didn't know. But that, it's still much larger and more interconnected. And I think Chris said there are 29 states is what. So there are lots of states that have adopted various. They all have different, X% by X state, and I guess I find it hard to believe they would do so without a very clear economic case for it. So,
When did Texas do theirs? Do you know?
They've been in. It's been over a decade now. I don't know the exact numbers, but I asked Jenny before I came here. I was thinking like, is there a good story I could tell about another state that had proposed an RPS and it took a while to get through the legislature and maybe there was a lot of discussion. She said it's a little hard to find a state that was maybe reluctant to pass one because eventually they did. So that's kind of where they ended up, and I don't think there have been regrets on the Texas side. So if anything, everyone knows if people have been paying attention to any power grid news, you probably remember the 2021 event in Texas, and that did get political, of course, as things do. But in the end, it was the gas supply, the gas infrastructure not being prepared for those temperatures, and essentially wellheads freezing. So there's a reliability impact on the gas system, for instance. I don't know. I wish it should be easy to look up. And if you look at the NREL website, there is a lot of good information about the RPS, specifically about Texas as well. So I will point you there.
And our legislators don't like to be told about Texas. We have kind of a Texas thing.
Right, yeah, they've got a bad attitude about it. But, certainly with bipartisan coalitions in the House and the Senate this year, got a good chance. But really, you got to count to 40. Because if you don't get the governor on board for renewable portfolio standards or requirements or mandates, whatever word you want to. Yeah, standards sounds better than mandates. So even if you can get it through the legislature, if the governor's not on board and he vetoes it, you need 40 votes to override it.
The governor did introduce a renewable portfolio standard, though. It was a governor's bill 4 years ago.
Right.
Hope springs.
Yeah, but then he didn't introduce it again, did he, the next time?
That's correct.
Kind of walked away from it. But you're right, maybe if he sees public support in the legislature with a lot of votes, he'd go for it.
Is it time for us to start doing audience questions? Chris? No, we're good? Oh, okay, good. Well, in the 5 more minutes, how are we going to do this? No.
Save that for the end.
No, I mean, my question was about the obstacles in Juneau. And my other idea was constituencies, building a constituency. That takes time. I mean, where do you see optimism? Where do you see possibilities?
I'm not the right person to ask. We should get Chris to do this because Chris is really good at that. I guess it's not really my field,
Yeah,
right?
but you know
I'm
the
not,
numbers,
yeah.
right? So-
well, it's the right thing to do.
All right, give me your best sell, okay? I'm the guy, I'm not going to name names. I'm somebody that's got, we're at 39 and we need 40, and I'm that guy. Yeah. What are you going to say to me?
Fortunately, I'm not, because I don't do that work.
I know, but you could.
But I don't do that
and
work.
you have all the numbers.
But this, again, the story is pretty simple. Do you want to save $100 million a year on average? Actually, that's not even on average. That's sort of best case. On average, it's more. When you look at the possibility of high prices, and there's positive chance of that, do you want to save $100 million a year in today's money on electricity bills or not? It's like making all of our PFDs smaller by $100 million a year, every year. It's how are you going to explain to your constituents why you've raised their electricity bills unnecessarily?
I think you've also got to get all the utilities willing to publicly testify, well, it's two parts. Publicly testify in support of a renewable portfolio standards bill. Have them sit down the committees and say, we're behind this, we're not going to nitpick it, we're not going to stab it in the back, and then after they testify publicly, they need to have their lobbyists, who do the real work, tell legislators, yeah, we're really behind it, as opposed to testify in favor and then work the lobbyists around the corner and kill it. You need the utilities behind it, because there are some legislators who will listen to them and them only.
And I will say, if that is actually right, it's much more right than not, but if that's determinatively right, then it's difficult, because just on the electric side, getting all four utilities on, in alignment around something like that is catastrophically difficult.
Yeah. And you could maybe do it without them. It would just make the job a lot easier if they were.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I think we have to hope for, if we can get one or two people, utilities, on board, then that will be exceptionally helpful.
Right. If two support it and the other two plead no contest, that could get you there too.
Sure. Well, and even last session, we had a bill which solved, well, we hope, we'll see, was intended to solve the problem of transmission tariffs making power more expensive, depending upon where you lived in the Railbelt. And, that was a bill which was not universally supported. In fact, it received a fair amount of pushback from at least one of the utilities, and they got rolled. So it can happen, and it does happen, but it would certainly be easier if we had more support. I will say, as a former commissioner and as someone who worked at a utility and now someone who's on the outside in dialogue, my observation is that the most important coin of the realm in that space for the people who work in that area is influence and control. And there's just a general reluctance that most of us have, I think, to being told what to do. And there's all kinds of good reasons for why what you're telling me to do is not a good thing. I can tell you all sorts of reasons why it's a bad idea. So there's, I think that's just kind of built in an inherent problem. Chris Rose likes to point out that most states that have passed renewable portfolio standards have had to do so over the objections of at least some utilities. Certainly in the beginning of this process. I think probably at some point people realized, investor-owned utilities realized, actually this is not such a bad deal because we can make a lot of new investment and make money on that.
That's what I don't understand. And I know I've asked this question 6 ways to Sunday, but you used the phrase catastrophically difficult. Why is it catastrophically difficult to get some utilities on board with this if it makes such good sense and it's cheap?
Well, it will be cheaper after you give me a bunch of free transmission that I don't have to pay for. It'll be cheaper after I study. I mean, part of the problem is, Marty alluded to it before, right? There are challenges to get from here to there. And so an engineer who's looking at that today says, well, there are challenges from here to, and I don't know how I'm going to do it. So I'm not sure that it's actually the best thing. And the thing about power engineers, you got to keep the lights on all the time. No breaks, right? Like the one thing that they are professionally sensitive to is if I go home at the end of the day and there's been a blackout on my watch, that's awful, right? So you want to make sure that that never happens. And so there's natural professional reluctance, I think, to embrace these sorts of things, especially when you don't have you don't have a whole team of people like Marty who are working like hell to figure out, now, how are we going to do it, right? So instead of having a mission, we've got to do it, so let's do it. It's always a sideline, right? There are not enough people at these places anyway. So I think it's just a natural built-in reluctance and not enough resources to take things on. So it's like, it's cheaper if everything goes right or if many things go right. And I'm not sure yet, so let's wait.
A reluctance to be the person who makes a decision that maybe turns out wrong, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, of course, in the meantime, decisions are getting made, and we don't have any alternatives. I mean, I think that a really important thing to recognize, remember, again, is utilities are monopolies. We do not get to shop around. We have one source of supply, depending upon where we live. And so there is no market discipline. And so in the absence of market discipline, we've got regulators, and we do not and pretty much never have had an activist regulatory commission of Alaska. Some states do, we do not. And so in my view, that's a problem because none of us have voice. We can't vote with our pocketbook. And so if we want to effectuate change, we have to use policy to do that because these are monopolies and our institutions are actually set up to give consumers voice through things like the RCA, which unfortunately is extremely expensive and not very responsive right now.
Your turn. Much better questions than mine, I'm sure. And jump in, whoever feels like answering. Would a single utility on the rail belt be able to deliver cheaper electricity?
I think when we say single utility, I don't think needs to be one merged company, but what's more important from the technical perspective is a single operator is, at least from the perspective of modeling, that is what we assumed in the model. It's actually generally how these models are run for any given area is that this is part of the ideal world. There's relatively perfect foresight of what the future might look like, and all of the decision makers on the system are all working together to make the cost optimal, mathematically optimal solution, and that requires a single operator to be able to dispatch units all across the rail belt. So I would say a single operator is how you get towards this cheaper solution, because that's what we studied. We didn't look at if they're all independently operated. That's something that could be done, but it certainly would lead to a less optimal case. Anytime you add more constraints in the model or make something more difficult, add a tariff, add some kind of like a wheeling charge, a pancaking tariff that was just, I guess, abolished this past session. Every time you do that, you add cost to the objective function, which is the total, essentially the sum of all the costs at the end of the day. So short answer, yes, but it doesn't need to be one company.
I think in answer to that question as well, I mean, I think that's a not subtle and incredibly important point. it's always been a dream for a lot of folks. Like, let's just create one Railbelt electricity company. And if you were designing it from scratch, that's exactly what you would do. There's no question about that. Because, again, we're small. But we're not there, and given bylaws of how the co-ops work and so on, it's incredibly difficult to even imagine moving towards that future. But fortunately, it's not necessary. We just need one operator to get the most efficient system, and that happens in the lower 48 all the time.
So I guess for a little context, in the lower 48, you have many layers of organization, and it's honestly still baffles me too. You have what you think of as a utility, a load-serving entity, which is the one you actually pay your bills to, and that might be like your Duke Energy or Excel, for instance. But then at the larger scale, you have what's called an independent system operator, and they run many states worth of the electric grid. So for instance, the Mid-Continent independent system operator, they are the ones that are actually running the grid everywhere from Minnesota down to Louisiana. So that includes multiple utilities in one independent system operator. And they're independent because they're not making money from the consumers. They're just dispatching the grid so that it stays reliable and essentially reduces overall cost. So things are different in a smaller system or islanded system like Alaska, but generally that's how it is done on large power grids. That's separate from all of the reliability organizations that manage the kind of on top of all of that to make sure that all the utilities are operating in a way that maintains reliability. But yeah, again, there's many different kind of organizations, and they're generally above the level of utilities in terms of geographic scale. So it gets pretty complicated pretty fast, but there's a reason for that, and that's how you can get towards this least cost solution. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have time to build out the wind generation capacity to avoid LNG, or is it a both and solution?
I think in some ways you could import LNG faster on volume than getting enough wind towers up and the transmission lines built.
Yeah, and it's not just that. I mean, the biggest problem is end-use customers transitioning them from burning natural gas to heat their home to having heat pumps and using electricity to do that. I think that's tricky because you're trying to induce many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individual households to shift over. So I think it's both and eventually I think it's probably likely, assuming we get some LNG import price spikes on the heating side and renewable energy gets more established in the state and people are used to it and they know how to deal with it on a bigger scale, that we'll see a gradual transition to much deeper penetration of using electricity for heating.
Does the LNG shipping infrastructure exist to serve such a small market?
Well, you've got the pipeline system. So if you can get the gas here, you can put it into the pipe at Nikiski. Say if you offloaded it there, you could, if you leased a ship, and they're available around the world, to act as your floating import terminal. If you leased space at the former ConocoPhillips LNG export facility in Nikiski, you'd have to make some modifications to the dock, to the offloading pipeline connections, but it wouldn't be ungodly expensive, I guess. You're not talking billions. You're probably talking in the low hundreds of millions, plus, the LNG ships, the kind of floating import terminal. I've seen 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 million dollars a year, and that's just to lease the vessel. Then you pay a charge as you move gas through it. So we have a lot of what's here, but not everything, but it could be done before the, before the end of the decade for sure. Depending how long, if you can go find that ship, or one's got to be modified, and you got to wait for the shipyards a couple years. But we have a lot of what's here, but not everything. And that's for the temporary solution, as opposed to, oh no, I want to build a big onshore thing that's going to last 30 years. That would take a long time.
I want to build a pipeline.
Well, we do. We have a pipeline fixation in this state. It's like that's the answer to everything. And that's a real problem. You've got to overcome that.
Yeah.
It's a guy thing.
It's not. It's an Alaskan. No, it's an Alaskan thing.
Well, the last one was so good.
Right.
Well,
Yeah, and what about the cost overruns on the last one?
what additional strategies could we deploy to reduce Railbelt demand for natural gas?
Make it expensive. Sort of flippant, but you do get demand destruction if something's too costly.
Well, it's funny, Chugach Electric just had their first rate case post-acquisition of ML&P, and REAP, with extremely generous support from Earth Justice and foundation support as well, intervened to try to get the commission to order Chugach to establish rate structure which would encourage conservation. Or encourage efficiency. And so one of the things that we were proposing was that for residential rates, we have an incline block rate structure where the first 450 kilowatt hours are priced at a fairly affordable rate, but if you use more than that, then the rate jumps up significantly. So it makes the marginal consumption quite, significantly more expensive. This sort of rate structure is fairly common in a lot of other states. And so you do more of the you have lower fixed customer charges, you recover more of the costs on the variable kilowatt hours of consumption. It just basically penalizes consumption, so it encourages people to consume less. You do a similar thing in terms of commercial customers who right now or a very large proportion of the cost recovery from commercial customers is on the instantaneous demand in a 15-minute interval during the month, as opposed to the actual amount of electrons that they consume, which is, again, not particularly good as incentive for getting people to consume less. So we worked very hard collectively on trying to get the commission to order Chugach to do this. It was about a 9-month process in terms of our work, and we were poured out. The commission paid no attention to our proposals. But rate design, in terms of how electricity rates are structured, can make a significant difference kind of all by itself. Public education can, utility-sponsored programs to encourage electricity, energy efficiency, common in lots of other states. We almost entirely moribund here. We have a little bit of stuff here around the edges, but there's a lot of things that has been done outside for a long time, and we just really have never picked up on any of it.
AEA claims there are nearly $3 billion of upgrades needed for Railbelt transmission. How much of that is needed to get to a 76% renewable grid?
Oh, that's a great question. So in our study, we did not actually assume, so I think a large portion of that money would be going towards the Northern Energy, so the one that connects Cantwell, Healy, so essentially the Matsu Valley up to the Golden Valley. Because of the uncertainty on that particular upgrade, we just went ahead and assumed that wasn't going to happen ever up till 2040. We did assume the Kenai upgrade occurred, and that was based on many discussions and some federally pledged dollars that I think rely on a state matching. So still a little bit uncertain what's the status is with that money. But we assume that did happen, and that's how we got to the 76%. I don't think we published a run that looked at no Kenai intertie transmission. So I can't speak to what it would look like without that, but I can say that we got to 76%. Essentially, 76% was still the cheapest without that transmission upgrade. So that'll make things a lot easier, but it doesn't change the overall economics. One thing that upgrading the line does do is, of course, allow, if a lot of your wind is up in Golden Valley, if you have hundreds of megawatts, but you only have a 75, 78 megawatt line, that restricts how much of that wind can come down to the load center in Anchorage. So that will limit the value of that wind. Even if it's cheaper, even if it's cheap on an energy basis, if it can't get to demand, then you have to curtail it. We have to waste a fair amount of it, and that will cause it, in the model at least, to increase in price. So there are a lot of benefits, and it essentially, transmission just makes the case even stronger, that those cost savings. But yeah, we did not assume that that line was upgraded, and I'm not sure how much. I guess that's kind of why we didn't assume. I don't know, $6 billion, that's what AEA says, but I don't think there's even a clear understanding of what that might cost. So, yeah.
Similar here. What are the pinch points to more rapidly integrating renewables? Why are projects taking so long?
Well, they're taking a long time in part because we don't have a lot of developers up here. They're taking a lot of time to put together in part because the wind projects that make sense are larger and do require or are dramatically assisted by having multiple off-takers. And so you have difficult commercial conversations among the potential buyers. So that's a pinch point. I think there is a significant pinch point, which I've alluded to before. It's kind of my big broken record on a lack of capacity within the utilities to engage in commercial negotiations as well as devote enough people to doing the technical work to figure out exactly what they want and how it's going to go. You know, they're pretty thin. These co-ops are pretty thin. They do a very good job of keeping the lights on with the current system that they have. But everybody's busy. And so taking on more, they don't hire more people. They have to work harder. So that's, I mean, those are all pinch points. There are probably other important ones that I'm not thinking of right now, but I think those are important ones.
Will the cost of imported LNG impact the whole rail belt equally, or will some regions feel the impact more profoundly than others?
I think it depends which utilities have more years left on their gas supply contracts at the at the more affordable prices from Hillcorp. Is your contract going to run out in 2027? Or NSTAR, I think, is covered 31 or something. So electrical utilities would be burning more imported LNG than NSTAR initially and for a few years because their contracts are running up. But then I don't know, Matanuska Electric, Chugach Electric, where their supply runs out, what they're paying. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Golden Valley does not directly burn natural gas, right? They historically have had a significant chunk of their electricity that they buy that's generated from south of the range and goes over the intertie. Last I looked, I think it's the case that that amount has been dropping in part because of the Cook Inlet gas situation. So they're, instead of being able to buy natural gas-fired generation from south of the range, they're having to generate more on their own. And so their rates have already started to go up as a result of this gas situation in Cook Inlet. But they rely on it less, so they're somewhat less affected, and they're not affected by heating, for natural gas heating from Cook Inlet. I think of the remaining three on the Railbelt, proportionally anyway, Chugach is going to be affected less. for two reasons. Reason one, they have a bigger proportion of their portfolio which is met by renewables. They're up to almost 20%, or right about 20%, which is more than anybody else, by a couple percentage points, not a lot. But the other thing is that Chugach also has an ownership stake in the Beluga River gas field in Cook Inlet, so they own some of their own gas. Now, Chugach expects that that gas field is going to need to be shut in, or beginning, I think, as soon as 2033, which is a nasty surprise for them. I think they were hoping and expecting that that field would last at least till more like 2037 and maybe extend, but unfortunately the reserves are going the other way.
And Homer Electric's the one that runs out first, right? or has.
Yeah, well,
or runs out of gas
And
contracts.
what do we learn from that?
well,
How
Homer.
did NSTAR handle that?
Homer is a bitter story for all of us. I'm assuming most of us aren't. I mean, I saw Scott Waterman here, and he lives in Homer, so Scott got a really good deal. So Homer's gas contract rolled off, and for reasons that I find unfathomable, Homer didn't negotiate with the producers in Cook Inlet themselves to secure their own gas supply. And instead, they went to NSTAR and said, hey, NSTAR, you got a lot of gas under contract. Can you get us some gas? And for reasons that are not totally obvious, NSTAR said, well, we'll see what we can do, and had conversations with Hillcorp and said, hey, can you flex your supply with us so that we've got more gas, and then we'll sell the gas to Homer? And Hillcorp said, not really. But what Hillcorp has done is they've moved some of their supply up in time so that NSTAR can then turn around and sell that gas to Homer. But of course, Hillcorp needed to be paid for that, because Hillcorp still has got the same volume commitments to NSTAR that they had before. This is getting complicated. But here's the moral of the story is, for NSTAR to be able to secure supply from Hillcorp to then turn around and sell to NSTAR, they had to rework their contract with Hillcorp. And that cost money. And so their reworked contract is at a higher price, which we are all paying. We're paying for it in our electricity bills, and we're paying for it in our heating bills. And Scott Waterman gets a lower price on natural gas than he otherwise would, because the increase in cost that Hillcorp has experienced, which is being spread out over all of our gas, which is a big volume, that was caused by Homer. So Homer is getting a big cross subsidy, which we're all paying for. And it sailed through the Regulatory Commission. There was nobody who protested or complained.
We have a pretty astute audience here, I think. Instead of a gas pipeline from the North Slope, has anyone looked into constructing a North Slope gas-fired power plant connected to Fairbanks by a new transmission line?
Is Mira Kohler in the audience? This was Mira's project about 10 years ago. She was hell-bent for leather. We need to have a high-voltage DC line from the North Slope to the rest of the rail belt, and we'll power the rail belt off of North Slope stranded gas. So it's been looked at. It's a mega project. It's pretty sexy, you know? So it's been looked at.
You'd have to get the air quality permit for running that gas plant on the North Slope. I think that would be a challenge. And then, as we've talked before, you're entirely dependent on one line coming down from the North Slope through the Brooks Range and everything else. And because that's going to go out sometime, you're still going to have to maintain all your other facilities to be on standby.
Right, and so and they need a gas supply.
Yeah.
So it's Anyway, when Mira was really interested and excited about it, none of the Railbelt utilities were for exactly that reason. It was that single point of failure problem.
Yeah, I think if you're able to invest in a large HVDC transmission line like that, it would make more sense to continue reinforcing the existing network and accessing the myriad resources that already exist kind of down by Homer over here. That would make things like tidal energy much, there is so much resource that already exists. I don't think we need to look at the North Slope. I think there's lots of transmission availability. There's lots of resource availability that would benefit from that transmission down here already. So.
How do we ever reduce dependence on gas if the major use is for heat and the gas utility is a for-profit investor-owned business?
I think Anthony had mentioned that if you start converting to heat pumps, so you're heating your homes off electricity instead of gas, that's the way to do it, right?
Yeah, and the cool thing is if you're generating a lot of your electricity with renewables, which are stably priced, right? It's a flat price. You're insulating yourself from these price shocks. I was reminded looking at this chart recently of Cook Inlet gas prices. Actually, it predates that line there, but the last time we had real big concerns about gas availability, deliverability in Cook Inlet. At the time, NSTAR went into the heating season with not full requirements under contract. And so they tested out creating a spot market. And so a little spot market happened. It did, and Marathon and ConocoPhillips both fed that spot market. And we saw prices spike to $15, $16, $17, which just coincidentally was the opportunity cost associated with exporting the gas as LNG. At the time, we had an LNG export facility. And so it's like, well, we'll sell it to you locally, but we're not going to sell it to you locally at less than what I can get for export, which is exactly the same position we're going to be when we're implementing LNG. Like, we can't expect that we're going to get somehow, we're going to get some great contract deal.
I want to make sure we're not running out of time here.
Chris could stay for hours.
Two more questions. Okay. We got 2 questions. Is that good? 1? 2 more. 2 more. Okay. How likely is it that the Railbelt electric utilities transition to being primary? Sorry. I forgot what I was doing here. Is this on? How likely is it that the Railbelt electric utilities transition to being primarily transmission and distribution focused? Could others mostly handle generation?
That was just an interesting idea. I'm probably out of my depth here, so I don't want to overstep.
I'm totally out of my depth.
I think that depends. I got to chat with the head of the independent power. How do you say AWIPA, the Alaska Independent Power? Sorry, I forget the acronym, but Joel Groves, and he brought up an interesting statistic that I wasn't aware of, although it didn't surprise me too much. That in the lower 48. 48% of all electrical generation is from an independent power producer. So, the rest of the utilities essentially only, a traditional utility, as you're thinking about it, only produces 50% of the power. And it's an astute question that, transmission and distribution are the things that an IPP isn't going to handle, and that's something that utilities will always still have to manage. I don't think that percent will go to 100% in Alaska. I don't know. I think it just depends on who has the staff to build these plants and who has the ability to work on full time on these types of projects. So from the perspective of the Railbelt wide system, in our model, it doesn't make any difference whether a wind plant is developed by a utility or if it's an independent power producer. The cost overall to the system will be the same. Of course, there's a lot of nuance there and how contracts work to individual businesses, but that's not something that we looked at. So it's kind of, it doesn't quite really matter who builds it, and I guess that would mean that it is possible that utilities could largely shift away from the generation side. Of course, all of the existing assets that are owned by the utilities are still going to be very critical in maintaining reliability, and so those will need to be maintained and kept available to be run at a moment's notice. Storage facilities, anything that provides non-energy services like capacity or essentially reliability services, operating reserves, we're not, generation is and that's why I like this question, is really one piece of the puzzle. It sort of gets the most attention because where is power coming from? But there's so much else that goes on to have that power get to your light bulb that is just as important. So, yeah.
Great question, great answer. What is a practical, likely next step, this is for all of you, that can make a difference to help us transition action from the state legislature, governor, utility boards, public mutiny when rates spike? What is the most practical, likely next step that can make a difference to help us transition?
I think talk to your legislator. I mean, they're the ones that are going to have to vote for renewable portfolio standards and look at legislation. And it's not like they make decisions based on a straw poll of people who confront them in cars or Fred Meyer, but talk to them so that they're hearing from you, from constituents, from ratepayers, not just from the people in suits who wander around the building.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you because I think that, I agree with you, but I disagree with you in that, you write a postcard, but if you see the guy or gal in cars and you talk to him, it actually does make a difference. I mean, we have these, what do we call them, barbershop bills, basically because the legislator heard some crazy idea next to him. What we really should do about pothole, whatever, and then all of a sudden it's a bill.
Yeah,
but,
it's got to be face to face.
Face to face really does work.
Yeah, it does.
I completely agree with that. I think I do think that showing up at co-op board meetings and having those conversations and voting in those elections can make a difference as well. Both directly in terms of the policy directions that the boards suggest, but also indirectly. I mean, if we can get support from utility boards, one or more, for a renewable portfolio standard, it provides a lot of cover for legislators to be able to say yes. And so I think both of those avenues are incredibly important.
You got to weigh in too.
Okay, I'll give maybe the boring answer, which is that there are practicals. I'm thinking about, from my perspective, there are more studies that need to be done. So, however that can be encouraged.
Studies.
I know that people always think, well, how many more studies do you need? There are still technical challenges that I want to look at.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be better if you were looking at it because we had to do something, rather than let's look at it to see if we should do something? I mean, that's certainly my bias. It's like we need to decide what the direction is, and then the studies will follow because we have to hurry up and do it.
With that, Chris?
Hi folks, I'm Chris Rose. I'm the Executive Director of REAP, and I just wanted to thank you all for coming tonight. This has been a great crowd, a great presentation. I want to thank all of the panelists for being here.
Chris, can you get on stage so we can see you?
Yeah, sure. Get up here in the light. I also want to wish Elizabeth happy birthday. Here she is on her birthday. Doing a wonderful job once again, so thank you for being here tonight.
There's no cake.
These guys just mentioned a few things that I wanted to talk about, but we have practical things we can do. And what Anthony just said about going to the co-op meetings is super important. That's here in town or wherever you are. Your local co-op meetings are usually once a month. Sometimes they have committee meetings in between, but you can go there, you can show up in person. That makes a huge difference. Last year, Chugach Electric Association did pass a resolution supporting an RPS. That's a big deal. We want to make sure that they even strengthen that resolution. We like to see Golden Valley and Homer and MEA consider those same kind of resolutions, because that will give political cover to folks down in Juneau to do that. Not everyone can meet with their legislator in person, but you can try, especially now between now and January when folks are leaving. There's an opportunity to go talk to your legislator in person if you just don't happen to run into them at the grocery store. Writing letters is good. I mean, postcards that are all the same, not so good, but I think when I'm down in Juneau and I hear people talking about a bunch of different texts or, faxes or letters coming in on a subject, then people start to make notice that something's happening. So making it clear to legislators that you understand this is an issue that needs to happen now. And that's the last thing I'd want to express is there's urgency here. The utilities right now, especially NSTAR, are all negotiating on a gas contract. What we're concerned about is a long-term gas contract that would potentially lock in our electric utilities into continuing to use natural gas for the long term, and then not taking advantage of all the tax credits that we still have for 8 years, we hope, and not transitioning. So there's a huge urgency. We have a new legislature. We actually have an opportunity, we think, to potentially pass this thing in the next year because it's already been heard for 3 years. So we do have an opportunity to do things. Last but not least, consider supporting the work that we're doing. You're doing that by being here tonight. Keep an eye on our website, watch what we're doing, and we'll keep you posted on the developments as the legislative session gets started. So thanks again for being here, and round of applause for the panelists.